Makes Me Wanna Holler by Nathan McCall. Chapter 21. Sex. Each day, I find myself fighting an intense battle against sensuality. I have attempted to obliterate sexual thoughts, but obviously to no avail. I even tried drowning myself in books and comprehensive studies, but at the slightest reading interval, those thoughts burst through my consciousness, filling me with frustrating tension. The battle has become so acute that excessive tension and headaches are becoming an integral part of my day. Give your problems to Jesus, people say, but I wonder, does Jesus want to share my whorish lusts? June 5th, 1976. Just think. Before you got locked up, you were getting some every day, or at least every chance you got. You were throwing down hard, pushing up like it was going out of style. Then, a judge plays God and sends you to the dunce corner. Suddenly, you got a big problem. You got a serious Jones that won't let go, and you got energy coming out the yin-yang. That energy builds and builds until it fills your chest with heat. The heat of 1,000 suns, and makes you so horny you get dizzy and aggressive and evil all at once. It's the kind of feeling that makes you want to haul off and punch somebody for no reason at all. For no reason other than you got all that energy and nothing to do with it. And you're in a place where everybody's got the same problem. Everybody feels like Superman with a hell of a hump on his back. You ain't seen no tension until you seen that shit. You haven't felt any pressure until you lived around dudes, hundreds of them, who act like they're in the desert with nothing but sand, and they start seeing mirages, luscious, eye-popping, thirst-quenching mirages. It brings new meaning to the warning, watch your back. When I was in the Norfolk jail, Mo Battle felt compelled to school me during some of our talks about the dangers I could expect to face when shipped to prison. He said, "The penitentiary is very different from jail, young blood. You got cats in prison that's been locked up a long time. Them cats are as dangerous as wolves. They can play some serious head games on you if you don't know what's going on." Through the years in Cavalier Manor, I had known enough cats who'd been to the joint to get some sense of what to expect, but Mo Battle ran down specific snags that he thought I should take care to avoid. He ran down a laundry list of traps that he said guys often slip into when doing their first prison bids. Don't build up too much gambling debt, man, because a guy can use that as an excuse to try to make you his bitch. Don't trust nobody but your homies. Don't let nobody, not even your homies, put their hands on you, man. I'm saying, don't even let them pat you on the back. That might sound crazy, but you'll understand when you get there and see how it is. Somebody's going to want to try you, man, and you got to handle it. Mo Battle made me nervous in some of those conversations. He made it seem like there was no way I can expect to go in, mind my own business, and do my time in peace. I was comforted by one thing, though. I knew I would kill if the need arose. If I have to, I shut down my mind and take a nigga out any way I could. That's a perverse thing to be comforted by. But facing the prospect of being threatened, sexually or otherwise, in prison, I felt good in knowing that I had the heart to do whatever was necessary to survive. I didn't fear being raped or taken advantage of. I dreaded running into a situation that forced me to do something that might run up my prison time. In conversations in the cell block, I heard nightmares about guys who went in with small 2- and 3-year sentences but got more time tacked on for cold cocking or shanking another inmate while under lock and key. The thought of running up my time scared the hell out of me. I doubted I had the endurance to do the time I already had, not to mention more. I must have hoped by thinking in terms of making parole the first time up. In Virginia, an inmate is eligible for parole hearing after serving a fourth of his time. I set my sights on doing 3 years and making my parole the first time. That meant I had to stay out of trouble, stay squeaky clean. So I made my resolve. I ain't gonna bother nobody, but ain't nobody gonna take advantage of me. Surviving was going to be a chess match that I had to win. Evenings and weekends when the weather was nice, guards sometimes opened the fence to the ballpark and let inmates play basketball, football, and baseball or jog around the field. Remembering what Mo Battle had said about the need to avoid physical contact, I gave up basketball and football completely. Instead, I played ping pong and went sometimes to the ballpark and sat on the long concrete wall where dudes hung out and rapped. Shortly after getting to Southampton, I was sitting on the wall with one of my homies, a guy we called Feetball, chatting about people we knew on the streets. A coffee complexion brother around the same age as me, Feetball was easygoing and loved to talk about the streets. Every time we got a chance to shoot the breeze, he steered the conversation in a cavalier manner. I was glad when I heard you shot Plaz, man. That nigga always thought he was bad. He stopped in mid-sentence, looked curiously at another newcomer walking by and said, "Look at that guy. He looks like Wanda Malone." I looked at the inmate, blinked my eyes and looked again. I thought, Wanda Malone is a girl. I looked at the guy a third time, focusing harder. Seeing no resemblance to Wanda, I turned to Feetball and said, "Man, get out of here. That guy don't look like Wanda." "Yes, he do. Look at his face. He got the same complexion and everything." I gazed at the guy again thinking, is this cat serious? Nah, he can't be. He must be joking, messing with my head. I fixed my eyes on Feetball, waited for him to say he was just jiving, but he didn't crack a smile. In fact, he went on to talk about another subject, as if his comment about the inmate were no more unusual than a statement about the weather. Man, I sure hope they let us out to see the program on TV tonight. I tuned him out. I was still thinking about his earlier observation, wondering if this bid had screwed him up in his head, or if the accumulation of stints in the joint had finally caught up with him. Since he was around 12, Feetball had spent more time in prison than out. He started going to reform school when I was at Waters Junior High, and he graduated right on up through the prison system like other people moved through public school. By the time he reached age 18, it seemed he spent time at practically every prison in Virginia. It wasn't unusual for his older brother and him to be locked up at the same time. A lot of dudes at Southampton had brothers, sisters, and even mothers and fathers in other prisons at the same time. Feetball had already been locked up at Southampton for several years when I got there, and the time didn't seem to get to him much. He never seemed disappointed when he didn't get weekend visits, and he never acted like the place bothered him. He was just doing time, like it was a natural part of life. As Feetball went on talking, I stayed quiet and nodded every now and then like I was paying attention. I didn't want to let him know he freaked me out. At the same time, I wanted to hear more to see just how fucked up his head really was. I hoped he'd break off his own and say, "Okay man, I was just jiving with you about the guy looking like Wanda." But Feetball kept on talking about other things. At some point, the whistle sounded and we had to go to our buildings. Before we split, I hesitated briefly to give him one last chance to say he was kidding about Wanda. Instead, he said, "I'll catch you later, Holmes," and walked away. I said, "Yeah, later," and started walking toward my building. As I walked, I shook my head trying to figure out what it all meant. Inwardly, I knew. Feetball had seen so few women in recent years that some men looked like women to him. The frightening thing was, he wasn't even aware of it. Later, when I thought about it some more, it scared me to death. It made me wonder if after being locked up a long time, I too would start seeing mirages. At Southampton, there were chasers, otherwise known as booty bandits, and chasees, cats who didn't have the will and heart to kill, even for the sake of keeping somebody literally off their ass. On the sidelines, there were cats who out of principle or revulsion chose to suck in the energy, suffer, and sit out the prison mating dance. They watched and watched out. A homeboy in the Norfolk jail once told me that when he was last in the penitentiary, he took 2 shanks to the shower with him every night. I draped the towel over my arm and hid the shanks under the towel, he said. The cat probably never got clean, but he stayed pure. Although I felt safe at Southampton with all the homies there, the level of paranoia was high enough to keep me alert. The first time I dropped my soap in the shower, I looked around before bending down to pick it up. I was standing near the canteen, talking with some homeboys when a guy called Tootie walked by. One of the homeboys, a guy from downtown, called out to them, "Hey, baby." Tootie turned sharply, squinted his eyes evilly, and said, "Go to hell, punk." Then he turned and stormed off. My homeboy glanced at the others standing there, and they all smiled knowing smiles. I was surprised that my homie would crack on Tootie like that, and amazed that Tootie let him get away with it. After being locked up a while, I could tell by the way guys looked or carried themselves in the yard whether or not they might have problems with the wolves. Tootie wasn't someone I would have guessed would get hassled. Before the exchange with my homeboy, I assumed he was as suspected on the yard as anybody else. We come to Southampton around the same time and worked on the gun gang together. In that time, I got the impression he was as hard as anybody on the crew and that he could hold his own if need arose. Dark complexion and bow leg, he was about 5'10" and solidly built. He was loud and cursed a lot like he was bad. But I questioned his heart when he failed to put my homeboy in check. The law of that land dictated that he should have gone to war. After that exchange, my homies taunted Tootie regularly on the yard. "Hey, baby, when you gonna give me that brown eye?" Tested him to see how he'd respond. It amazed me that guys weren't ashamed to let somebody see them cracking on another man. In fact, in a warped way, they were proud. It fed a macho notion widely accepted in the joint that a guy was even more of a man if he could flip another man, turn him into a homosexual. They also called it breaking him down. If they thought they spotted the mental weakness that they could exploit, they'd chip and chisel at it until they got results. Sometimes it took months before they got a breakthrough. Sometimes it took years, which was no big deal for somebody doing time. Clearly, someone spotted something in Tootie, the way he looked at somebody in the shower or the way he carried himself, that made them think he was right for being broken down. I wonder what they saw, and I watched to see how that budding drama played itself out. They jeered and teased him, and when he still didn't retaliate, they turned up the heat, openly treating him like a woman, throwing him kisses and calling him sweetheart on the yard. Then they turned up the pressure more, touching him, pinching his butt, and called him girl. Finally, they made a major move. I reached the R1 building, where we had our own rooms with keys. There were guards in R1, but they patrolled the halls less often than the guards in other buildings. One evening, I was heading to my room and heard a commotion coming from another room down the hall. It sounded like somebody tussling, bumping against the cabinets and bunk. I passed one of my homies in the hall and asked, "What's going on down there, man?" "They running the train on Tootie." At first, I didn't think I heard him right. Then, as I thought back to those wild days in Cavalier Manor, it sank in. They're running a train in the penitentiary on a man? Life is crazy and it's getting worse. I went to my room and closed my door, afraid that if I stayed in the hallway too long, I might see something, or rather somebody, come out of that room that I didn't want to see. The next day, word spread on the yard that Tootie was in a dispensary being stitched up. Several months later, he was somebody's boy. That whole ordeal taught me a lot about the power of the mind. It demonstrated that if you don't know who you are, and if you don't believe fully in yourself, others sense it, no matter how much you try to front it off. My homeboys had psyched Tootie out by treating him like a woman until he doubted his own manhood. Then, when they had broken him down, they flipped him like a pancake. I could always tell when the tension level was high. There'd be less joking going on, and allies hung closer together on the yard. The most telling sign this time was the posturing of dudes in the Tidewater and Richmond gangs. Members from each gang stuck tighter than usual on the yard, eyeing each other hard. I found out there were rumors of war. Normally, it took a lot to bring those two gangs to blows. They talked trash to each other, especially when playing football or shooting hoops, but a mutual respect underlay it all. Yet it was understood that if a rumble jumped off, both sides were ready to throw down. I went to Pearly Blue and asked him what was up. "You ain't heard, man? They competing for this new bitch that just came out of the receiving unit. Her name is Pauline. They're waiting to see who she gonna choose." "Who she gonna choose?" I echoed, confused. "Yeah, she just came on the yard and she ain't chose nobody yet, so the brothers are getting kinda uptight cause she looks good. She looked just like a bitch." The Richmond and Tidewater gangs each had their best rappers vying for Pauline's attention, and all kinds of candy, cigarettes, and other gifts were being sent to her. That was another one of those penitentiary mating rights that had been around so long that old heads acted like it was the most natural thing in the world. All the chatter made me curious. There were a lot of closeted and openly gay guys at Southampton, but this was the first time I saw the excitement generated when a new, openly gay inmate came on the yard. I wanted to see for myself how the new guy looked. I only saw him once at a distance and then he disappeared. As soon as prison administrators found out about the tensions he created on the yard, they put him in protective custody to calm things down. He stayed in lockup a long while and tensions eased. I'd forgotten about it till one day, when as part of our Christian fellowship activities, I was visiting the lockup cells. The administration let us go to the lockup area on weekends to witness, talk to inmates, and try to get them interested in God and the Bible. I finished talking with a guy at one cell and moved on to the next, and there he was, standing at the bars, looking straight at me. I jumped back surprised. Pauline looked just like a woman. He was about 5'8" and very slender. Tan complexion and clean shaven. He had long eyelashes and seemed to have plucked and arched his eyebrows like women do. His hair, long and straight, looked like it had been tinted a reddish blonde. He even had his gray prison shirt rigged to look like a woman's blouse. Instead of buttoning it down the front and tucking it into his pants like everybody else, he had left it unbuttoned and tied the tails together in a knot, revealing part of his flat chest and trim waist. His chin provided the only clue that he was a man. If you looked hard, you could see the outline of where he shaved. I collected myself, then walked over to the cell and spoke to him. "Do you believe in God?" "Yes, I believe in God. I was raised in the church," he said in a soft, high-pitched tone. "Are you saved?" "I accepted Jesus as my savior a long time ago." "Well then, how did you get like this?" I hadn't intended to be so blunt. It just spilled out that way. He told me a long story about how he was molested as a child by a teenage uncle who was his babysitter. For a long time after that, he said, he'd been confused about his sexuality. He even got deeply involved in the church and asked God to help him resist temptation, but gave up fighting because the homosexual impulses were too strong. Although his real name was Paul, he said he preferred to be called Pauline. "I feel," he said, "like I was meant to be a woman." On the streets, my homeboys and I had always called gays sissies and freaks, and we'd hassled them. But listening to Pauline's story, I saw that he spent much of his life at odds with himself. I sympathized. Yet there was something about him, his feminine manner and the way he gazed into my eyes when he spoke, that made me uneasy. I enjoyed talking with him, but felt the need to get away. So I did. I bowed my head, recited a short prayer for him, then said goodbye and moved on to another cell. Pauline was eventually released back into the prison population. Whenever I saw him on the yard, I spoke to him briefly and kept walking. He made me feel self-conscious and awkward, and I felt even more uneasy about the prospect of being seen by guards or inmates talking with someone who was gay. Ultimately, Pauline chose as his man a smooth-talking, go-to player who was the quarterback for the Richmond Gang's football team. They walked around the yard together like a couple on the streets. The prison vets and wolves looked on jealously. Guys in the Richmond Gang gloated she belonged to them. Mrs. Pinckney was one of several teachers who helped the inmates at the school work toward earning their GEDs. There was one other female teacher, but compared to Mrs. Pinckney, she wasn't much to look at. A short, petite woman in her early 30s, Mrs. Pinckney was dark-skinned and thin-boned and had big brown eyes and full lips that glistened from the bright colored lipstick she wore. Other inmates stumbled over each other trying to open doors for her, carry her books, or do anything to command her attention for a few minutes. Every time Mrs. Pinckney came to the restroom, inmates rushed into the library to the men's bathroom. They punched a tiny hole in the wall, enabling them to peek down over the woman's toilet next door. Although I wanted to go, I didn't. I believed that if I saw what other inmates said they'd seen, it might drive me over the edge. Besides, I didn't want to give in so easily to Mrs. Pinckney. I was certain she was a tease. She never said anything to suggest that, but after studying her dress and manner very carefully, I concluded she knowingly tortured us. She wore very high heels and fitted skirts that hugged the contours of her shapely body, and she walked slowly, swaying her hips gently, beckoning me. It seemed to grab her around the waist and pull her to me. She wore strong perfumes that inflamed my nostrils whenever she was near. I said to myself, she has to know she drives us crazy. I loved and hated her all at once. Like everybody else, I was drawn to her, but I resisted because I didn't want to join the list of guys whose hormones she controlled. In spite of myself, I gave in sometimes in other ways. Every time she came into the library, I grew dizzy and went to war with my emotions. One day, she strolled over to the card catalog where I was flipping through some titles. She asked me if we had any old issues of Ebony magazine. I'm giving my class an assignment, and I want them to research the material in those magazines. Yes, ma'am, I said. I'll check for you. While she waited in the main section, I walked into the back room and began leafing through stacks of magazines piled on the floor. When I had gathered a stack, I took them to her and said, "Let me know if you need some more." As she took the magazines, my hand brushed slightly against hers. The sensation lingered and I felt dizzy. I resumed working, trying hard not to stare at her. Still, when she sat at the table and casually began turning pages in the magazines, I watched from the corner of my eye. I drank in every detail about her, including the contrast of her bright red fingernail polish against the black and white pages she turned, and the way her black hair fell just so, revealing the base of her delicate neck, the neck I wanted to kiss. I fantasized about an exchange between us. In that fantasy, she confessed a secret desire for me that was stronger than my own lust for her. Every other inmate, I'm sure, imagined the same thing. For a while, she and I were the only people in the library, and I couldn't resist taking advantage of that rare moment alone with her. I thought, what if we talked and realized we had some common interests? Maybe she likes to read the same things I do. I glanced at her sitting in the corner reading. I had to think of a way to get her to interact with me. I returned to the storage room and tore through the stacks of magazines until I found more back issues of Ebony. I stood there with the magazines in my hand, trying to figure out what to say. I carried the magazines to Mrs. Pinckney like a child trying to win favor with an adult. I took a deep breath. "Here," I said. "I found some more in case you need them." She looked up from her reading. "That's all right," she said. "These are enough." Then she gathered the magazines I'd given her, picked up her pocketbook, and headed for the door. I was left standing there with an armload of magazines, hating her only slightly less than I hated myself for letting her make a fool of me. Before prison, I had been aware, but not really conscious, that there was a vast psychic difference between men and women, and I had never really considered what women added to the world. Then I realized that if prison was any indication, a world without women would be crazy, stark raving mad. It became clearer than ever to me that women brought a lot to the table that the world couldn't do without. They brought balance, beauty of spirit, and sanity. Lots and lots of simple sanity. I seen some who were as messed up in the head as any man, but all things considered, women generally knew more about being human beings than most men I had come across. Women brought a dimension to life that I discovered only after being placed in a fenced-in universe from which they were absent. In the visiting room, I watched their mannerisms, the way they held their hands when they talked. I noticed how they dressed, and other little details such as their earrings hypnotized me. I could even pick up their perfume fragrances at tables near mine. Sometimes, while in the visiting room talking with my parents, I'd hone in on one of the fragrances or mannerisms of a woman at a table nearby, and my heart would float over there against my will. I'd fight off the urge to get up, walk over, and plead, "Please, can I just sit here a minute and talk with you?" Sometimes sexual tension got so heavy in my chest that I felt I might just explode, blow up in a puff of smoke. I knew I had to come up with some strategies to beat that energy down. For starters, I got rid of all those Playboy pinups in my room and stopped cruising through freak magazines that would get me upset. When I realized that the sight of women on the screen also got to me, I damn near gave up watching TV altogether. I got so thoroughly out of the habit of watching TV that I seldom turn on my television set even today. I also designed a regimen to help me keep myself in check. I'd rise at 5 and write poetry or make journal entries until breakfast time. Then I'd go to work, eat dinner, jog, and stagger back to my room. Later, I'd go to the basement and lift weights to work that strangling tightness out of my chest. Exhausted, I'd shower, return to my room, and read until the lights went out. I'd put on my headphones, listen to music, and stare out that porthole of a window at the stars in the night sky and think. I thought more about women than I had in my entire life. I think about all the hatred and abuse the fellas and I had heaped on women, and I promised God that if I ever got out of prison alive, I'd never mistreat another woman as long as I lived. Lying in the darkness, I caressed myself and let my imagination soar beyond Southampton's long country roads, the places where the world was turned up right. I'd pick up a date and we'd go out for the evening, to a dinner or a movie. Maybe we'd walk and talk. I imagined entire conversations I wanted to have with women. In my fantasy, the ending to my lovely evening was always the same. We'd go to my date's apartment, embrace, make love, and fall asleep exhausted. Then I wake up the next morning to the haunting, shrill sound of the prison whistle, signaling that it was time to start a new day.